Hi everyone, this is Suzanne Simon with Restore America's Estuaries. We're going to go ahead and get started because I know everybody has a very busy and packed calendar. Quick reminders, please put yourself in mute just to be on the safe side. All of you should be muted on our end from the admin side, but you never know. So for those of you who have not joined us before, we are Restore America's Estuaries. You can see our mission there. We're dedicated to the protection and restoration of bays and estuaries as essential resources for our nation. Those are our 10 member groups all around the country. And through them, we reach a ton of people, and our member groups do amazing, amazing work. So this is the monthly, as I call it, virtual gathering of the Living Shorelines Community of Practice. Thank you very much for joining us. So what we're going to do, you can see the agenda up there. We'll go through some quick national updates, and then I will turn it over to folks as they would like for some regional updates. And then we'll have Jim Johannessen with Coastal Geologic Services talking about his decades of work in the Pacific Northwest, working on nature-based living shorelines, bulkhead removal, things like that. So without further ado, I will go ahead and provide some national updates as I have them. The 2018 summit in Long Beach, California, it is very quickly approaching. It has an amazing Living Shorelines lineup. We'll have 10 plus full sessions plus posters. So it'll be a great opportunity, and I know based on what I can see here, a number of you will be in attendance, and I look forward to catching up with all of you. The other thing to keep in mind, I've mentioned it before, I will keep providing updates. The 2019 National Living Shorelines Tech Transfer Workshop, that is going to be in the fall of 2019. Stay tuned. We haven't announced dates yet. We are working to finalize the venue, and once we get that contract signed, we'll get the word out as soon as possible. It is slated to occur in North Carolina, which, as I think everybody knows, took a direct hit as a result of Hurricane Florence. So a number of the venues there have taken some substantial damage. So still working with the venues on that one. On a housekeeping note, the great news, the great problem, if you will, this community practice list has gotten large enough that we're starting to trigger spam filters when I send out the monthly emails. So we will likely be switching to a constant contact type list, which should make it easier on some fronts for folks to manage and get through their spam filters. So on that note, for anybody that wants to provide an update, either national or regional, go ahead and use the control panel for the webinar and raise your hand virtually, and I can call on you and I will unmute you. The other option is you are welcome to send a question or comment through that control panel, and it will get to me and I can offer it on behalf of the group. So I will see, are there any national updates that folks want to provide? All right, seeing none. Are there any regional updates? I see a number of folks from all around the country are on this call. Are there any regional updates in terms of workshops, documents, post-hurricane performance, anything on those fronts? Okay, seeing none. It's a quiet group today. All right. So without further ado, I will introduce Jim Johannessen, who, like I said, will provide some perspectives from his efforts over the years. I will say, A, he's a fantastic guy. I've had the chance to work with him over the years. And B, a shameless plug that he and one of his projects is in our National Living Shorelines video, which you can see through our website. It's a great video. We produced it a number of years ago, and we tell people that they can use it at town meetings, whatever they want. It's been used in a variety of circumstances. Feel free to use it as a way to introduce folks to living shorelines. So Jim specializes in beach and estuarine assessment, mapping, and restoration design. He started Coastal Geologic Services in 1993 and has worked since then all throughout Puget Sound and what in that region are called the Salish areas. He was the lead author for the 2014 Marine Shoreline Design Guidelines for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and Beaches and Bluffs of Puget Sound White Paper for the Puget Sound Nearshore Partnership and the Army Corps. So, without any further delay, I will have Jim's screen show, and he will take it from here.
Okay, Suzanne, can you hear me?
Yes, it looks good, sounds good.
Okay, great. And maybe, Suzanne, quickly, about how many people are on the call? And you said they're from many different states? I can't really see.
Yes, that's fine. Let's see. We have folks, from, I see DC, the Gulf, all around. Right now, I think we have about 15 people on. So we've got Florida, New Jersey, Washington State, Maryland, Georgetown, so DC area, in the Panhandle of Florida, DC EPA. That should give you a nice round estimate.
Okay, thank you. Always good to know my virtual audience today. So that's great. We'll have plenty of time for discussion and questions. I hope I'm not going to take more than 20 minutes or so here. Yeah, I'm based in Bellingham, Washington, so north of Seattle a little ways, working all around Washington State and a little bit beyond. So obviously Pacific Northwest, as Suzanne said. I've been doing this kind of work for over 25 years, very much project-based. So I, along with our coastal engineer and other staff here, we assess and design all sorts of different enhancements, restoration projects. We've been using the term soft shore protection for many years. The term living shorelines has gained a lot of traction, of course, nature-based solutions. So I'm going to show you a handful of sites, but first, understanding the Puget Sound region is highly variable. You can go along shore, a quarter, half a mile, you get tremendous changes naturally, of course, with the development patterns as well. Just a quick example on this image, this is a site where they filled a bunch of the intertidal with bricks 100 years ago plus, started a brick factory, roads, undersized culverts, scour holes visible here. Some of this site has been restored in the last couple of years. There's more on the way. But it's an example of one of our many habitat-driven projects, often trying to pull infrastructure out of the nearshore. In this case, there's going to be a 160-foot bridge going in that road that crosses from lower right to the upper part of the image. But this is one of our, somewhat larger projects. I wanted to kind of give a flavor of the projects out here, the techniques, but also I included an element today of what motivated these projects. How did they get started? How did they get nurtured along? I think that's a key topic for many of you. So direct outreach, there's been a number of grant-supported projects. A lot of this funding has come from the US EPA, from the past administration. There's been nonprofits around here, such as Northwest Straits Foundation, Friends of the San Juans, and then a number of salmon enhancement groups in mostly county-based around the region, and some others as well. And they have been able to acquire funds to do things like free workshops for landowners, site visits for landowners, technical ones. We've done a bunch of those approaches with these groups. And then, saying, oh, look, you have some project we could work on. We could help habitat. We could help you get access to your beach, things like that. Indirect outreach, as I'm calling it. So through all the public education, through all the counties and cities and state agencies, staff and their work, they're saying, oh, well, you should consider this, or you should consider talking to these people through regulatory and other approaches. Aging infrastructure, that's been a huge one here, and I think it is pretty much everywhere else, but a number of parks projects where things are falling apart, and they wanted to bring things up to snuff for the safety of the people, also to try to get habitats improved. Other public sites, tribal sites as well, and then simple residential sites, which we'll get to. Same approaches. I've got just a couple slides some of you may have seen in the technology transfer workshop back in Oakland early this year, like this one. So in the Puget Sound region, our state Fish and Wildlife has been tracking permits. This graph shows armor installation by year, cumulatively, so around a mile, plus or minus. Some big storm events in 2006 brought more new armor, as well as bits of armor replacement. And then we see going down below the zero line is armor removal, bulkhead removal. So that's been increasing. You can see 2012, a big jump, 2016, and then 2017, which I don't believe is tallied yet, should be a larger jump. So we're starting to get to net removals. Obviously in 16 we were there, and I believe we're going to be even further along in that road in 17 and 18. Regulations have gotten extremely tight for shoreline armor installation and even repair and replacement. There's a lot of habitat reasons for that. There's a whole series of management measures of discussing habitat, such as this one in the center from 2009. Some core funding helped provide that one. Core funding, the one on the left that we wrote, Beaches and Bluffs of Puget Sound. That same series had a lot of different key species with these short papers. Feeder bluff mappings for mapping sediment sources, and that's gone into protection and restoration planning. So there's many more I'm not showing you, but we've gotten our act together in the last 10 years trying to get sound-wide, statewide, and other studies. And now design guidelines were finished 4 years ago that we put together for these same groups, State of Washington, some federal funding. There's a whole series of these on river restoration, on water crossings prior to this one, over water structures. So there's just some good background info. Moving right along, a couple of quick examples from the Marine Shoreline Design Guidelines. Example of what's causing erosion. We go through all these things, all the background issues, discuss ways to understand erosion, natural or anthropogenic, talk about simple measures, drainage control, and so on, and then go into some nature-based solutions by topic, such as these. The bulkhead removal, the armor removal, we were asked to discuss specifically in a chapter. These best management practices are covered. And then these last 5, soft shore protection and hard shore, are covered with examples, with guidance, with and then a lot of monitoring results as well. So what's driving our funding out here, and many of our projects that are not necessarily residential but are larger, including some groups of residences, removal or installation of armor, particularly at feeder bluffs, to maintain sediment input, removal site-specific to allow along-shore transport of sediment, cross-shore connectivity. So that's the process-based, and then many site-specific drivers. Intertidal spawning of these forage fish, these surf smelt and sand lance, upper intertidal spawners like the grunion in California. These are primary food sources along with Pacific heron for returning salmon. Got a lot of habitat issues, a lot of habitat studies have been done through University of Washington and other institutions showing all these small connections. Increased organic matter. Turns out our Chinook salmon, which are ESA listed, are eating insects derived from trees in many cases, right along the near shore. So we've got a lot of soft shore design techniques. We've got a lot of armor removal techniques. Many of these are still, a good handful of these are getting built this summer, fall. I'll show you one at the end, scattered all around the Puget Sound region, the Salish Sea. few into BC that are not shown. So one of these previously shown there, this was a site which is residential, which was a direct outreach project by the local land trust, in this case Bainbridge Island. It's looking for larger parcels, residential or public, with habitat restoration, nearshore restoration available. So this family owned 1,500 feet of shore, several houses, and this Salmon Recovery Funding Board, SURF Board, cutely called, has provided a bunch of funding for projects like this and others, state funding. This was a pretty straightforward removal. Very, very little material went back in. You can see the various rock, concrete, and creosoted wood structures. We've got an area where the rock was just removed and vegetation, which is stashed up above, was about to be planted. This is a tight close-up here, vegetation just about to go in. We've had about 80 or 90 years of isolation from the near shore, a little bit of pickleweed transplant, saltgrass, salt marsh, and then just a year later, extensive exotics removal already occurred, and then native plant installation. This was a lot of bank face, bank top planting, and then transplanting on the upper intertidal. This is a project which is armor removal again. A lot of this this is for a very highly utilized surf smelt spawning beach. So again, we're salvaging vegetation with limited transplant, primarily the rock removal, such as this. It's a low energy shore. Taking this away by barge in this case, and providing the area for this surf smelt to be recreated. So you can see there just one path of removal right through the middle there. This is after the tides come in and out on the removal pile. We're halfway through here. Beach nourishment materials coming back in. And sorry, back one. So project ending here. And then the next phase of project, hopefully we'll get to some more private owners with permission further beyond. So a drone overflight of post-project, we were instructed to leave rock along the bank of the tow. We and others were concerned with stability for the county road. So let's take a look through here quickly. Okay, here's where the barge was. This was just after the project was completed. A little pile of sediment that couldn't get graded because the barge had to leave that spot. And then in the distance, you see there's no project, so you can see it gets coarser. We're doing a lot of monitoring with drones and structure from motion now, doing detailed surface change, habitat change, vegetation area change, all of those things. Very quickly, a project in the city of Bellingham, another indirect outreach. This is a public works project that they got onto some of the things that others were doing in the region. This is inside a very armored and altered shoreline, and estuaries, micro estuaries were recreated and salt marsh areas were cut into fill. There was a lot of eelgrass transplanting that went on in this lagoon as well. So it was hit subtidal, intertidal, and backshore. Here's before. This used to be a dog park. Turns out dogs aren't the best thing for eelgrass beds and salt marshes. Not very political topic locally. Digging out fill was one of the primary elements here before extensive replanting did occur. And then just about 5 years after, this used to be that dog park here. So we've taken that down and mostly natural recruitment in the intertidal. Very recent project. Here's another City of Bellingham one. Turns out this is the Georgia Pacific mill that was shut down almost 10 years ago now. Cleanups are still going on. This happened to be one of the dioxin contaminated sites in the middle distance. And then there was fuel storage, all sorts of things in this particular area. The rock revetment was covering some of the most contaminated soils. But this little beach in the foreground, which was underwater at mid-tide, and this creosoted bulkhead was a subject of transitioning this to a new park site. So we did a lot of excavation. Here's the beginning. You can still see the bulkheads in. So we're back Christmas Eve almost last year. A lot of soil testing and removal, of course, went on as part of this to various levels of landfill. A lot of gravel was imported. We've got a park infrastructure just starting to get laid out. A little more gravel piled up, ready for final grading. Of course, they're in a finer material. The shapes of the park and the trail are starting to take place. You can see a few more features going in. So this is a federal waterway in the background. Part of it's been decommissioned and no longer will be dredged to allow for continued natural covering of slightly contaminated sediments. This entire GP site is going to be converted over time for mixed use. And then we've got some anchored well, not anchored, just some keyed in logs, a few stones, a little bit of shore protection on the ends. Just before the playground, crucial factor, and as it stands today. So we've got a lot of planting in the foreground and the background. They didn't want to see any planting in the gravel beach itself. This was a limited public space. But we're even planting on the riprap in the background, right down into the upper intertidal. And this is literally a month after plantings went in, so things are just starting to take. I won't show you more than 2 slides on this project. Todd Woodard has shown this at the conferences once or twice. This is on the Samish Indian Nation pre-project. This was a cultural site with burials in this area that was eroding away, past failed, hard shore protection in the background, some what was called bioengineering at the time, some jute matting and things that had failed as well. Post-project, with the newest project just completed in the background, close to the Samish offices, much higher, planning for a greater sea level rise as the years went on in design, extending through this reach here. And finally, getting down to the residential scale. This is from the Marine Shoreline Design Guidelines. Failed bulkhead removal, not much of it. We had a house with a septic drain field just off the side that was threatened with breaching in salt water. There's nowhere to move the drain field or the house. We have 15 miles of exposure from our predominant storm direction. Site is in this Lummi Island area. Simple design from 2003. So we tried to get projects that have been in place for quite a while. We've got a high shore gravel berm and planting area in front of the drain field and the residence. We had a neighboring bulkhead that was updrift with wave approach coming this way. So we had to transition off the corner with a few boulders and a log, which you can see the boulders, and there's a buried log in there. This is after the first couple of winter storms. The berm is up here. The initial planting is on top. Looking at the profile through, again, from Design Guidelines site studies. We had the pre-project profile with blue, the erosional bank. We had the design, which was this slug of gravel with beach sands and gravels on top and planting, shown right here. And then we have the 2012, after 9 years, this gravel was moved onshore, which is usually, well, which is always what we see. Gravel moved up and onshore, and very little change out here. And then year 9 photo with the landowner busy scurrying out of the image. We use this native dune grass a lot, Lamus mollis, current Latin name. Things like snowberry and Nootka rose natives for erosion control. Too high energy on most of our shorelines for intertidal vegetation. Okay, finally, this is from a few days ago, rock removal and cleanup from, ironically, a Army Corps low-cost shore protection installation from the late 70s. Not so ironically, most of their techniques failed within the first year in a big storm, and we came back decades later to clean up the debris with a grant-funded project, removing it all off-site with a short haul by truck to barge to road. This is Whidbey Naval Air Station. We've got about 5 of these projects going on this year. This is one of them through, in this case, this Northwest Straits Foundation locally. Okay, so summing up, we've got habitat restoration being a key driver. I should add regulation being another key driver of limiting armor. We've got more and more regional guidance documents and best available science. We're using many complementary techniques on most sites with armor removal and scaling it down if not removed, removing fill, regrading, nourishment primarily through gravel, lesser sand, lots of vegetation, sometimes large wood installation. I went through the different origins and funding sources that are listed there as well. I've got my email there. This pictured as a project site. We hope to reopen this berm and elevate and bridge or somehow open up this former beach berm as well for this small lagoon, but funding is elusive at the moment. But Suzanne, we could open it up for discussion now.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be fantastic. So for those of you who are participating, please raise your hand virtually or send a question through the control panel for the webinar. And in the meantime, while we wait for those to come in, I guess, Jim, one of the things that we try to do on these conversations is to try to figure out, lessons learned from, you've been doing this now for decades. What are your big takeaways? In other words, if there's other people that are trying to do this in a different region, what would you say, like your top handful of takeaways?
Sure. Yeah, maybe those weren't super well framed for that part of it. I mean, part of what I obviously showed you is a great diversity of sites. One of our opportunities is often aging and damaged infrastructure, be it a bulkhead or being a much more substantial structure. So when managers and owners are, talking to their local, their friends, their local nonprofit, the jurisdiction, we want to have reached those people as a community. So those people they're going to say, oh, well, there's some new approaches. There's some examples. Go look at this site. There might even be a little bit of funding. Go talk to this person. So the more outreach, the better. Of course, related to that, our residential properties on the coastline have a high turnover rate. So you need to continue to do the outreach. And again, this is a group effort, community-wide. The outreach can't be really strong for 2 years and then take a 5-year break. That doesn't work. It's continual. We need to tell people the opportunities. We need to, of course, pitch the positive parts, which are many, which are better beach access, which are better aesthetics, which are getting rid of liabilities, such as falling down structures, getting rid of toxic materials, such as creosoted wood, and make the connections to habitat, which many of the newer generation are very much identified with, if not older folks as well. Another thing that's good to mention is, a lot of the projects I've shown you are significantly cheaper than replacing armor structures. So we've got a lot of projects that come in at half the cost, sometimes less, sometimes a little more, depending on logistics. As I mentioned, there's some grant funding available if they're willing to, quote unquote, do the right thing. So just need to put the right people together for that. And then another way to look at this, there's great value in having public demonstration sites and making them as visible as possible. And I'm a real fan these days of getting web apps, getting people to be able to quickly link to websites to get their information, to stop making books, but making websites instead, for example. So that's a summary of that part.
Great, thank you. A question has come in. can you please provide more information about the origins behind the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife or regulatory impetus to remove hard armoring and restore habitats?
Yeah, great question. So Fish and Wildlife is one of the regulators, but their codes and their direction, their mission isn't quite as strong as our local jurisdictions. So Fish and Wildlife has been trying to point people in the right direction when they come for permits, but half the time they can't deny projects, they can only condition them in our state. But at the same time, they have some talented biologists that are trying to connect people together, trying to say, okay, county or city, your code says they can't do such and such. Because in our region, the State Department of Ecology has some oversight of the local jurisdictions, and their shoreline management programs turn out to be the strictest. And the reason being is we've had a whole series of peer-reviewed and great literature showing the direct impacts and the indirect impacts of these armor structures, of fill, of simplified habitats on the forage fish, on the ESA listed species like salmon, and then the connection straight up to the ESA listed orcas. And then in our marshes, we've got these juvenile salmon and many other species using them heavily. So the best available science is cited by ecology. Local jurisdictions have to meet a certain standard of protection, and no net loss is also written into that code, which is state level implemented at the local level. So that's been our regulatory regime, and then of course projects that extend into the intertidal go through the Corps and the federal regime, which is which is tightened up prior to which tightened up years ago with ESA listings I mentioned back in '99. So that's it in a nutshell.
Gotcha. So do you think, so I should also, for the folks who don't know this on the call, because I didn't give my bio, I got my grad degree at Western Washington University as well, where Jim did. So I had the privilege of living out there for a while and understanding some of the regulatory stuff. So out there, it is, as you alluded to earlier, really, really driven in some cases by listed species, particularly salmon and now orca. Do you think that there would be that same regulatory push without that strong ESA kind of backstop, if you will?
Yeah, interesting way to look at it. I'm sure it would be a lot weaker. Without that federal law, I bet we'd be about a third of the way to where we are today. There's, you know how local jurisdictions and the state can be. They get tons of legal and political pressure to allow the status quo to go on and on. So yeah, without that federal law, I'm sure we'd be nowhere near where we are today.
Interesting. Okay. So a question about the shoreline design guidelines. You referenced those in your talk earlier. What exactly is covered in those?
Well, there's a synthesis of the natural processes. There's lots of course, links and references to that they're available. We first emphasize avoidance of habitat degradation of intertidal work, for example. We then go through best management practices, as they're called in this regard. Controlling stormwater, controlling surface water flow, avoiding building in the wrong place, and then a list of more modern practices, such as moving houses landward, moving low elevation houses vertically upwards and/or landwards. And then once let's say you can't do those things for various physical reasons, we talk about here's some alternatives to hard shore armor. So there's a long chapter each on such as beach nourishment, such as using large wood, resloping and revegetating banks, as well as if the hard armor is the only alternative, than how to do it without maximum impact. And let me go back for a sec. There's also a long chapter on alternatives analysis. And we felt that was very important, along with our funders, to give some more structure to working through the alternatives instead of letting every consultant or homeowner design their own way to do it, trying to provide some structure, and with risk to primary improvements being the driver of what level of intervention you need. So instead of it being, well, height of the bluff or value of the infrastructure or something that sometimes seems arbitrary, we have a way to calculate, well, estimate risk to structure. And if you don't have a certain moderate or high risk, the intention is you cannot do certain activities such as hard armor. Now, it's not binding, it's not regulatory, but the regulatory agencies are using this to a fair extent. And so trying to formalize these processes was the goal of the alternatives analysis.
Gotcha. Thank you. So you had a really impressive example about that 9-year project where the profile didn't change much, or if anything, it improved to benefit the property. Is that typical in your experience? Do they do mostly well? And also, how do they hold up to storms?
Yeah, I could. We've got a lot of monitoring data. So as I mentioned, excuse me. As I mentioned, some of these sites are just, most of these sites don't allow for intertidal vegetation. That's one of our differences with, say, the inside Chesapeake Bay folks. So we're doing marsh restoration where we can, but most of the sites it's just not an option. So the reforming, reshaping, uncovering, rebuilding the beach profile is one of the primary techniques here. And the monitoring from, probably 30, 40 sites has shown consistently that the gravel will move on shore. So just like I showed you in that one example, I've got it for many other sites. There's the beach in the National Living Shorelines video you mentioned. Excuse me for a sec. Okay, so the gravel beaches tend to throw, the sediment gets thrown up the profile. And in our artificially nourished or natural beaches, the sand gets, be pulled down the profile, down below the upper sloping beach and down around extreme low water. So that's during the summer, some of that sand comes back, but it's an ephemeral feature. So the monitoring has shown that the large majority of these projects have not needed any maintenance for the first 20 to 30 or 40 years. There's a handful that have needed maintenance after generally 20 years or more, primarily on the updrift end. I've got some of these projects following Wolf Bauer design back in the 70s, where there's been nourishment done, again, limited renourishment. We've done limited replanting in a few sites, but again, sometimes with augmenting backshore sand as well. So there is a lot of data. It's summarized not quite as well, but there's a lot of great literature and a few peer-reviewed ones that document that.
Wow, it's impressive. And in my understanding, a lot of hardened options in 20 years would need sometimes full replacement. So, the fact that there's some, sounds like relatively little maintenance, it definitely is certainly in the pro column. Switching gears, so you mentioned using drones. I know this is something that is becoming increasingly of interest and increasingly used around the country. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with that? How you use them, how you found them to be helpful or perhaps frustrating sometimes, and I also noticed that you sometimes work near Department of Defense installations. So, are there any concerns or clearance? Because I know, quick tangent, I know our member group, Tampa Bay Watch, often uses them, and they have to be very careful around some of the Air Force bases. So, just talk about some of the pros and cons and considerations and lessons learned with drones?
Sure. Yeah, we've been able to, well, getting permission to use these drones has been a bit of a struggle. We just got permission for one site the other day we asked for about 4 or 5 months ago, for example. They say, the FAA says they're catching up with all that and they're going to be quicker in the future, like less than 90 days, very, very blazing speed. We work in and around the Naval Air Station, several other Navy sites, for example, and we are not allowed to use them there. Within 5 miles of an airport, you know, I've not been able to use or have a 400-foot ceiling, I think it's been. We've flown sites as big as a couple miles long and done, you know, quantitative topographic mapping by setting ground control. So, you know, we're doing a lot of this monitoring by drone these days, using AgiSoft PhotoScan, for example, as the software. Always, you know, some of the sites are harder than others. Of course, overhanging trees have been a significant problem on a few sites. And, you know, we don't have the luxury to wait till the leaves are off. And of course, with the timing of a lot of these projects, we're considering getting a fixed wing drone to try to step it up and be able to do larger areas, carry a larger camera. Haven't taken that step yet. And any more specific questions on that from you or anybody else? I'm not sure what would be most useful for folks.
I think that pretty much covered it. So if anybody has any other specific questions about drones or anything else, by all means, please submit that. We did get another question come in. To your knowledge, have you seen the relocation of other types of structures, for example, houses, septic systems, like with the Lummi Island example you referenced, to benefit habitats, or is that not a goal in these instances?
There's a house being moved in a couple of weeks I worked on. Is a very interesting site. Maybe I'll quickly try to navigate to show you that. There's a house atop about a 150-foot bluff, and we're trying to get a little bit of more quantitative information on the exact cost of that these days. It's been, we've been involved with moving houses back before, but it's been very hard to get the actual final costs on those sites. But this house is a pretty interesting location. I can show you here. It's a frame house, 2-story structure. So this is a site on Whidbey Island, kind of in the center of the Sound. Seattle here, Bellingham where I'm standing today up here. So zooming back in on this Whidbey Island site, I'll show you what kind of mess they were in. Right over here, there's a long drift cell that's going south to north by this site. But even at this elevation, you can see a wee bit of landsliding. And see, it's this house right here. Tell me that doesn't look close. So not the best. It's not even worth it. So back to vertical format. Actually, this is not the house.
So what's the bluff height there? What's the bluff height there? Just to give people an idea.
Sure. This is a house we should be moving. We're actually moving this one, which should also be done. This is, like I said, about 140, 150 feet high. It's been a very active bluff. So their deck is under the trees. It's right out to the edge. There's been active sliding the last few years. The house is back 30-some feet. It's going to go back here somewhere. I'm not sure what the neighbor's doing. They weren't interested, but kind of a nervy spot. They're going to do some modifications to the house the same time they're moving it. So the moving and the new foundation are, of course, the largest expenses. Years ago, it could be as cheap as $40,000 for a house. 15 years ago plus, when we first started doing this. This one might be in the order of double that, maybe a little more. We're waiting to see.
Wow.
Like I said earlier, there's been other houses that are moving upwards that are subject to flooding. A couple of residential houses that are moving up and back from spits. I mean, this spit itself has flooded numerous times in the last few years, not quite into the finished floor of a few houses I know, but it's been getting more frequent with time and perhaps higher elevation.
Interesting. And I appreciate that you pulled up Google Earth. That's great. That's very helpful to see. Okie dokie. So we do have a couple of other comments that I'd like to get to, and these are slightly not off point necessarily, Jim, but these are some other things that folks I think would like to reference. Do you have any other kind of closing thoughts on your years of working in the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, it's time for that. Well, I think that, the people have been getting the message more and more. We've, of course, had a bit of a crisis with orca populations recently, and recommendations are coming down in steps of ways we can take more action, statewide, soundwide. So more and more people are tuning into that problem and the need for solutions. We've got lots of sites that are transitioning from one generation to the younger generation, and or whether through the family or just being sold. Had a number of owners that say they want to clean things up, get this old junk out of the way, restore processes. They believe in sea level rise. They want to plan for it. So we're seeing more and more of that. At the same time, of course, the federal funding has greatly been decreased. Luckily, it takes a while for it to trickle down because there's still a little bit around. So maybe that'll increase in the future again. The regulation-wise, the science has been a crucial step to having, the solid science behind the ideas of limiting modifications in the nearshore and trying to restore them. There was a lot of pushback for years, but now there's more and more peer-reviewed articles and the like. There's getting to be less viable pushback on that regulation change. I guess looking forward, it's only going to get tougher with sea level rise. So it's going to be time for much bolder action, and we need our states to step up and start to look at future conditions instead of what's essentially past conditions. It's going to be more and more critical. Right now, it's a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis around here. We don't have strong state guidance, but we're getting more guidance. Other than that, with aging infrastructure, we are seeing more and more opportunities for change. Things are falling apart by themselves, with or without us. In other places, groups like us are being asked to help redo things. So there's great opportunity and great likelihood for change just because of how the structures from 30, 40, 50 years ago are really starting to come apart more and more. So I think that's the high points I can think of now.
That's great. Thank you, Jim. I really appreciate it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take the screen back. There we go. So there is information to reach Jim. So I do want to pivot just a little bit. I did get a comment from one of our attendees in the Florida Panhandle who said, and Rick, if you want to raise your hand virtually, I'm happy to unmute you if you want to give a little bit more. He said, I just got back from our project at Shell Point, south of Tallahassee, and it survived the hurricane without major damage, which is great news. Here we go. Rick, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's basically it. I went down to the coast, and it's a very small living shoreline project with bagged oyster shells. I was concerned that the bags were going to be scattered all over the place. They were pretty much right where they were originally installed. The marsh was mostly fine. There was a lot of damage in the neighborhood behind it. There the road was lined with debris piles, and there were boats up in people's yards that had been thrown up from being out in the water. So yeah, it was very encouraging.
That's great. And you're doing okay?
Oh yeah. We did fine. I'm just east of Tallahassee, so we were kind of on the outskirts of the hurricane force winds.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, thank you for that update. And if you have any pictures, that would be great at some point. Maybe we can share them that way.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, Rick. All righty. The other 2 points I wanted to make as we are winding up here. Jim mentioned the Oakland meeting, and I failed to mention this at the outset. The summary report for the Oakland meeting, which was in February, which is a National Tech Transfer meeting on living shorelines, that is now up and posted to our website. And again, I'm biased, but I think it's a lovely summary of what happened. And then if you would like to present, I think it would be particularly interesting for those of you, I know there's a number of you from Florida on, about post-hurricanes or extreme weather. I think that would be of interest and timely if anybody has any desire and photos and data to show on that front. Last but not least, this is being recorded, and once I clean it up a little bit, I will post it onto Ray's YouTube site. So with that, I'm looking at the time. I'd like to go ahead and wrap up. A big thanks to you, Jim, and to all of you who joined us today. Again, stay tuned. The next one will be November 21st, and I will be sending information out. Again, if you have any topics you'd like to hear, folks you'd like to see in terms of present, or even if you want an open forum conversation, I'm absolutely open to that. So with that, I will say thank you again to you all. Thank you again to Jim, and I will see you in November. Take care.